Elora could see Thorn clearly. Beyond was nothing, a darkness so absolute, Elora shuddered. She could feel solid ground beneath, but all her eyes revealed was featureless ebony, without the slightest boundary to demark the horizon. The scene tugged at her memory, the way a fish might nibble on a lure, mulling over that fateful bite. She looked to Thorn, only to be checked by the look in his eyes. The setting had struck a chord with him too. "What?" Elora prompted, but it was Corey who replied. "The dungeon!" Elora's mouth formed an O of comprehension. "Where you were imprisoned, Thorn? In Anguin?" Unspoken was a question for Corey. "Where you were reborn, a demon's soul bonded to a Daikini body." It was forbidden sorcery, the spell that had brought Corey into being, considered by many the blackest of arts. In the process, as Thorn had passed a portion of his human essence into Corey's body, so too was that offering, replaced in turn by a fragment of the demon. Supposedly, demons were irredeemably evil, yet Elora felt no sense of that from either Thorn or Corey. "Yes," the Nelwyn Magus said. "In the oldest stories, dragons are said to be the firstborn of creation. Some say it was their flames which lit the first celestial fires. Demons are their bastard stepchildren, who refuse to see the universe settled into orderly patterns. They are shaped by chaos. Yet from chaos always comes a rebirth, making them an essential part of the balance they seem hell-bent on destroying." "That makes no sense," Elora replied. Thorn smiled. "Now you know why sorcerers are always cranky trying to puzzle out the inherent contradictions in things." His grin faded, his tone turned serious. "This place, it's like Corey was before the spell, rich with potential, but lacking the spark of animation that would bring it to being." "A house," Elora said, "with nobody home. Are we overstaying our welcome?" "Here? Never. This is the realm of dreams, Elora. Supposedly, the only way to visit is in your dreams. Yet here we are, in waking flesh." Thorn nodded. "That wouldn't have happened if it weren't meant to be." "Does that apply to the Deceiver, Thorn? He beat us to it, almost claimed the power here, the future of all the great realms for himself. Even if the dragons were at the end of their lives, as Callan said, how could he have breached their defenses?" "A reason, I fear, for us to make our way quickly home, to find out, and to forestall him from trying again. So, if we're ready to," Thorn said, with an assessing look at both companions. "We'll have to go the way we came," Elora said. "That means passing through the Malavoy realm. They're the point of contact between the flesh and spirit realms. They'll know what's happened here." "Elora, child, every sorcerer worth the name knows what's happened here, even if they can't find the way to put that knowledge to words. They'll want these eggs, like the Deceiver, won't they? And for the same reason. Control the dragons, control the shaping of our next age. Answer me, child, something, will you? From your heart." "Anything," Elora said. "Hear me out first," Thorn continued. "These eggs, is it better to risk them falling into the wrong hands, or take the chance that they may be lost forever?" Elora's mouth opened to give her answer, but her brain trod both feet upon her mental brakes. "What do you mean, forever, Drumheller?" "Simple word, simple meaning. Strong as I am, any ward I cast can be broken, especially since the Deceiver seems uncomfortably familiar with our histories." Elora felt the quicksilver sensation of memories slithering through her grasp. Something had happened during her battle with the Deceiver. She'd been so caught up in her attempt to save the dragons that all collateral events had been shoved aside into a jumble pile she had no desire to sort through. "Strong as you are, Elora," Thorn continued, "you're barely grown, still learning about yourself, your liabilities. And Corey, for all her skill as a warrior, has none in the arcane arts. We're all of us mortal. We can be killed. Therein may lie our salvation." "Come again, mage?" "When you were a baby, I cast a spell of protection about you, keyed to draw its strength from your own." "I remember. It saved my life." "What I propose is much the same, an interlocking lattice of guardian wards to keep the eggs from being opened by any but we three." I thought any spell you cast could be broken. Good as I am, I stand alone. That means I have limits, but Corey is part demon, and you draw on reserves of energy that encompass all the realms. Imbue the spell with a portion of our collective life force, and I'll wager not even the deceiver can find a way to untangle that knot. The three of us cast a spell, the three of us must release it, of our own free will. Suppose, Drumheller, Corey asked, one or more of us should die. That's the risk. Is it better to risk the egg entrusted to your care falling into the wrong hands, or to lose it forever? Corey smiled, but there was little humour in her expression. It reminded Elora of a predatory cat. It's one sure way, she said, of ensuring our own survival. Elora snorted. Suppose we fall into the wrong hands. Can we be coerced into opening the wards, you mean? Yes, child, we can. Naught to be done about that. Of our own free will, we enter into this compact, and only of our own free will can it be broken. That's a lot of trust, Drumheller, Corey said. We're better for such a gesture than this sacred ground, Thorn asked, and who better to ask it of? Elora took Thorn's hand in her right, Corey's in her left. She was snuffling, but she didn't care. Her thoughts were a jumbling cascade of all the moments of her life that had led her to this one. Faces were etched in her mind's eye of those who had fought for her, died for her. Who am I, she thought, to deserve such companions? I'm willing, she said. Corey nodded assent. As am I, Drumheller. So say we all, he finished, and as one the three of them squeezed the hands they held. To begin, he continued, we'll need the eggs. Elora reached into her travelling pouch. There's just the one, she said in confusion, thrusting her arm into the pouch all the way to her elbow. It looks bigger than before, Corey noted. Take hold of it, Elora, Thorn suggested. Tell us what you feel. I don't understand, she said, cradling the egg. They're both here. Somehow they've joined. Magic. Of course. Can you fit it in your lap, Elora? She wriggled hips and bottom to sit them a tad more comfortably on her heels, and found that her burden lay quite naturally in place. Lay your hands on it, Thorn told her. He spoke then in the tongue of wizards. It was like someone striking a great bell in the core of Elora's soul. The sounds were beyond human hearing. The images that came to her in a great thundering rush were of granite blocks grinding into place, of raw iron hissing as it made its way from ladle to mould. Pops of sensation exploded throughout Elora's awareness. A needle stabbed through her, gathering a stream of fire that she recognized as the essence of her own life force. It arched through her, becoming more like an arrow, and she watched entranced as it descended to the egg to spin a cocoon of rainbows, flashing around the egg before stabbing outward to her fingers. Although the bindings covered every bit of the egg's surface, Elora found she could still see through the shell, and the sight she beheld there made her gasp. The fiery colours left by the energy stream were surpassed by a similar display from within the egg. It was like watching a pair of lightning storms, one complement to the other. She was so bedazzled by the show that she barely registered Corey's hands covering hers. The energy Thorn drew from her was of a wholly different texture, the colour of scarlet that echoed the hue of Elora's gown, blood. It defined Corey's being as the land did Thorn's, but laced thickly through those streamers was another hue that defied description, and even sanity itself, whose very presence in a living being seemed an act of utmost violation. They were Corey's strings, composed of both demon and human strands, laced with a portion of Thorn's soul to bind them together. In Thorn's case, the patterns of his life force were similarly coloured by threads of purest demon. The colour of the trio's threads merged, yet at the same time remained distinct, as Elora found herself dazzled by each intermingling perspective. The fires leaped and danced within her grasp, and she tensed the muscles of her arms to make sure her body was still awake, suddenly afraid that she might drop the egg and ruin everything. Her heart thundered. She couldn't take her eyes away, but knew Thorn and Corey were gripped by similar sensations. She now wondered if the mage had underestimated the power required for the task. What good was the safety of the dragon's egg if their own hearts burst in the process? Light blazed, blinding Elora. Then, without warning, the flash from her lap was answered by an infinitely greater explosion all around them. One moment they were in absolute darkness. The next they were cast into the heart of a radiance so pure it could not be endured. The trio were struck by as primal and all-encompassing a sound. Elora called it thunder, but that was like calling the core of the world hot. It was sonorous, yet cracked like a whip. Once more, she found herself in darkness, and gloried in the amazement of being able to find herself at all. That betokened awareness, which came from thought, meant she was still alive. She heard a finger snap from her right, where she remembered Thorn had been sitting, and his globe of radiance popped into being. Elora dropped her head to confirm that the egg was still rested safely in her lap. It looked quite unremarkable, without the slightest outward hint of the energies that now protected it. Without a word, she slipped it back into her travelling pouch. A sudden, nervous demand for reassurance sent her hand back to it, to feel for the egg and make certain it was all right. But what came to her grasp, and made her brows purse, was the lean, cylindrical shape of a sword hilt. The blade she drew was shorter than the broadswords she'd seen. Scabbard and hilt were plain, lacking ornamentation. In the light of Thorn's globe, steel gleamed like chrome silver, and when Elora held the blade out, it seemed like an extension of her arm's natural curve. "This is yours," she said, handing the scabbard to Corey. She took the blade, nodded approvingly at its workmanship. "Nelwyn forged," Corey noted, "but the alloy's more than metal. There's enchantment to this blade, Elora. The elves of Greater Fairy had their hands in its making." "Calendineer heated the forge," Elora remarked, "with his own breath." "And added his own lifeblood to the melt," Corey finished. "I can taste it." "How?" "He's dragon, I'm demon. We're kin. I'd know his kind anywhere, girl." In a movement swift and sure, Corey snapped the tip of the sword to the top of its scabbard and shot the weapon home. Then she held the sword out to Elora. "Your sword, princess," Corey said. "I have one." "I can't take it," Elora protested. "Whose hand found it? Nothing in that pouch comes to you by accident, girl. Me and Thorn can use it, but it's meant for you." Elora took the blade, but only because Corey didn't give her a choice. She slipped the scabbard beneath her belt, in the style of the Eastern Islanders. "Now what?" she asked, turning to Drumheller. With no more warning than the hiss of steel as her blade was drawn, Corey swung for Elora's throat. Thorn's mind registered the attack, but it happened so quickly his cry of warning perished stillborn, as Elora met it with a parry. Both women used their blows to surge to their feet. Corey had the advantage of height and strength. If Elora had an edge at all, it was her quickness, but that was crippled by the all-enfolding darkness surrounding the pair. She couldn't move beyond the painfully small circle of radiance cast by Thorn's globe. Taking a risk, Elora slapped her bare hand against Corey's blade, pushing it aside. She spun herself into a swift pirouette along her sword's length that brought her in the circle of Corey's reach. She made a one-handed strike with her weapon. The other was needed to keep Corey's sword at bay, but the blade itself was so sharp, even a whisper of contact would be sufficient to end the duel. "Stop!" Thorn finally commanded, using that single word like a cudgel to get the attention of both combatants. Elora's response was a glare of outraged defiance. The demon child, by contrast, offered a grin as she sheathed her sword and offered Elora's to her. "What?" Thorn cried. "In the name of the abyss was all that about?" "Won't be an easy journey home through the Malavoy domain," went Corey's reply. "Wanted to see if the student remembered her lessons." "You figure," Elora asked, "the Malavoy will be waiting?" "Them and others. You they want, Moonchild. They made that plain." And Elora shuddered at the memory of her encounter with the Malavoy. "Me, my face," Corey shrugged. "They'll likely remember." Elora turned to Thorn. "You'll have to be ready to fight too, Drumheller." "Whatever needs doing," he replied, "provided neither of you frightens me like that again." You didn't hold back, did you? Elora asked Corey, when you first attacked. You're alive, and you're too arrogant by half. You're the one who knows about arrogance, that's certs. Elora bristled. She didn't like to be reminded of the girl she'd become before Thorn rescued her from Angwin, spoiled without the slightest regard for anyone around her. She started life with a band of stalwart friends to stand beside her, and then, in a flash, that turned her dreams to nightmares, lost them all. She found herself cast from one side of the world to the other, into a land of strangers who cared not a whit for Elora, but whose goal was to use the sacred princess Elora Danan to advance their own political ends. The deceiver displayed much the same ambition, to supplant her spirit and soul within his own, and exercise her power himself. Since the only people who ever had faith in Elora had been taken from her, it was small wonder she grew into an adolescent with little faith in herself, especially since she'd never been able to banish the fear that Tiraslene's destruction was her fault. How do we go, Thorn? Elora then asked. Where do we go? The Shengwei speak of journeys to the end of time as beginning with a single step. Thorn rose to his feet. Shall we take ours together and see what happens? Bear steel, suggested Corey, but the Nelwyn sorcerer shook his head. Not to start. You expect the Malavoy to abide by hospitality? He grinned, and for that instant a surprisingly carefree spirit flashed from his eyes. You've both demonstrated how quick you are on the draw. We'll let them make the first move. He reached up toward the glowing globe of energy he'd cast, but Elora's hand intercepted his. She stepped right beneath the orb and opened her palms to it, caressing its surface as it descended in answer to her invitation, much as she had the shell of the dragon's egg. Leaving a candle in the window, are you? Thorn wondered aloud. To show us the way back? Something like that, Elora replied, but also to remind the darkness that it isn't alone. You think it's afraid? More, she paused, lonely. Inspiration touched Elora, and she reached into her travelling pouch to draw forth a stuffed bear. He's seen better days, Thorn marvelled. I wouldn't know, was Elora's reply. This is the best he's ever been for me. You were asleep when I brought him to you. Carried from Nelwyn Vale to Tiraslene on the back of a dragon, she recalled aloud, but kept silent the other part of the tale Thorn had told her years ago, that the dragon had been Calendineer. That must have been an adventure. I thought it was a dream. Sometimes I wish it had been, and that I'd wake snug abed on my birthday. One moment I was safe asleep in bed, the next I was naked in the war yard of the King's Keep in Angwin, the world shaking around me. The bear was in my arms. No one could pry him loose, not without breaking my arms and fingers. He was my protector, as I charged him to be. In memory, Thorn recalled how he'd held the gift before him and looked square into its crystal eyes, talking to it as he would a stalwart comrade in arms. His words of that cataclysmic night ran through his mind. All that I would be, were I here, let him represent. To his surprise, he heard Elora repeat them now. Do you know what you're doing, child? Thorn now asked. I'm caretaker of the dragon's egg. Then shouldn't Bear stay with it? What is hope but the essence of a dream? Corey's called me the hope of the world. That's how my name translates in the old dragon tongues. I feel like this is my home, as much as the physical Daikini world. I can't leave it empty. I'm taking away its soul for safekeeping. It seems only fair for me to leave a bit of my own behind. Isn't that why you left Bear with me? To stand surrogate for you, who couldn't be there that night. I should have, but then you'd have died, like Sorsha and Mad Martigan. Time to go then, Corey asked. Together, forming a rough triangle with Corey in the lead, Elora flanking her behind and Thorn bringing up the rear to Corey's right, they stepped from the light, and the darkness around them vanished, as if it had never been. They found themselves atop a mound of rocks, as though someone had smashed the stairs to heaven, leaving only the detritus one might find at the bottom of a quarry. The vista should have been breathtaking, for they stood as high as the summit of many of the peaks they knew. In the dragon's realm,
Form was minimal, but substance piercing. Every sense was heightened to a fever pitch, bombarding the consciousness with more information than it could process. The realm of the Malavoy, by contrast, was nothing but form. In surface impressions, it very much resembled the Daikini world Elora knew, although the landscape was more barren. What struck her most was the lack of substance, the sense that all the physical aspects of this realm had forgotten their purpose, in the way that people of a certain age tend to misplace the details of their lives. Glory here was found in savagery and destruction, not the mad chaos of demons, but something more wicked. Conquest had been the order of the day, but now there were no more fields of conquest. The Malavoy had done too much, become bored. Their land simply took its cue from that. Light came from a ghostly radiance resembling dusk. Everything was leached of colour, even the hues of Elora's gown registered to her eyes as grey-washed carmine. As for her argent skin, Elora thought that if she leaned against a wall of stone, she would disappear, her flesh indistinguishable from the landscape around her. She wondered then if that disappearance applied to more than the purely physical. This was a place where a person could easily lose herself, and while the ruling predators here might claim to be as old as time itself, she was certain they hadn't forgotten how to hunt. "You've been here before," Thorn said. "Which way?" Elora angled her chin toward a stand of ruins just beyond the base of the slope that stretched down from the trio's summit. "So far?" "Distances deceive in this place," Elora told him. "It won't be quite so long." "I will die here," she thought suddenly. "I will kill here. It will be good." She gave her head a violent shake to banish the cruel images of fangs and blood and laughter. When she was here last, en route to the dragon's realm, the Malavoy had said they wanted her for their own. What she hadn't expected, what truly terrified her, was that she found herself tempted by that offer. The best way to travel was over the fallen rocks. They could spend a score of lifetimes trying to navigate a passage through the hollows between. "What are they like, the Malavoy?" Thorn asked. "Creatures of dust," Elora said quickly, "for a realm crumbling about them. Less than ghosts, Drumheller." 12 rings are fixed on 3, she continued, remembering the words the Malavoy had spoke. "To be bound entire by one. That is the scheme and riddle of things." 12 great realms, Thorn said, making the connection. "Making up the 3 greater circles of being, the world, the flesh, the spirit, anchored and bound by the 13th realm, you." "How can the pieces hold fast," the Malavoy asked me, Thorn, "without a centre to anchor them?" "Ambush!" Corey called suddenly. "Where away?" Thorn asked. Fair-sized cadre, maize and black rose, close about the world gate. This was not good. The Black Rose were the most formidable arm of one of the most formidable fighting forces the world had seen, whose specialty was assassination. Their loyalty was absolute to Castellan Modri, who led the Mason, and that meant to the Deceiver, who wore Modri's flesh like a tailor-made suit. "Layered deployment," Corey finished. "Staggered too thick for us to sneak past or fight our way through." The Malavoy allow this? Even as she spoke the words, Elora found them hard to believe. "The Black Rose are here, girl. It must be so," Corey replied. "I guess we didn't hurt the Deceiver as badly as we'd hoped," Elora said, "when we drove him from the Dragon's realm. A prudent commander always has a backup." "Since the world gates closed to us, Elora," Drumheller asked, "can you sense another?" Elora pursed her lips. She found herself licking them often, trying to detect hints of taste. In any other realm, she'd be able to spot the natural lines of arcane energy. Here, she felt like she was sleepwalking. "This way?" she hazarded. "Then we go," Corey demanded. "It's too big a cadre for simply an ambush. They've numbers enough to cover the gate and send out rovers to stop us trying another." Corey scooped Thorn off his feet and onto her back, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. Elora found herself hard-pressed to keep up with the warrior's furious pace. They came to a gap, too deep a drop for climbing, bridged by a line of dainty pillars. Without a word said, Elora knew what was coming. The trouble was, the tops of each pillar barely had sufficient room to stand. If a successful crossing was to be made, they'd have to hop from one to the next in a single, continuous sequence. Who goes first? Elora asked. Depends on where the Mason are, Corey replied, searching the scree for a sign. Behind us it's you, ahead me. Flip a coin, Elora laughed. Can you do this, Elora? Thorn asked sternly. Is there an alternative? Corey can carry you. What about you? 2 trips, Corey said. Bollocks, Elora retorted. Sometimes, child, Thorn said with a paternal sigh. You talk like a stevedore. Sometimes, Drumheller. You deserve it. I can make that crossing. Elora gathered up her skirt, fastening it fore and after her belt to form a rough pair of leggings. She gazed around for any sign of pursuit or Malavoy, found neither. She tried to gulp some big breaths of air to supercharge her lungs, but found it wasn't worth the effort. She couldn't sweat here. Her body beneath the skin was hot with exertion, as if all her mechanisms for cooling had broken down. This realm would not tolerate extremes of any sort. At some point, if they continued at this pace, she knew she'd collapse. She wondered what would happen then, and spun around full circle where she stood at the faint sound of chittering laughter. It didn't come from Thorn or Corey. So, she said under her breath, as she readied herself to make charge, you are here. We are Malavoy. So you said when we met. Thou art the Danon. Hast thou come to claim thy destiny, to embrace us? Who says the two go hand in hand? Elora asked. There was the driest of chuckles from the Malavoy. The Danon must bind all, or she binds none. There must be balance, Elora hissed, repeating what she'd been told her last visit. It must be restored. Thou art the key. With a cry of defiance, Elora threw herself forward, honing her focus to the length of her stride as she rushed towards the precipice. There was no turning back, and she gloried in the all-or-nothing danger of that moment. Then, her trailing foot thrust her over the edge. 5 great leaps, like a sequence of giant steps planted square in the centre of each pillar, and she was across. Elora's elation was short-lived, however, as something tight wrapped itself around both ankles and her legs were yanked out from under her. Elora managed to break this fall with her arms, but she hissed from the scrape of rock on flesh, as though her skin were being raked by sandpaper. Her first thought was that the Malavoy had decided to intervene directly, but she knew this wasn't their style. What they had in store for her was more so seduction than conquest. They wanted her to join with them of her own free will. She sensed rather than saw another tether arching towards her, and levered herself to the side, moving in a 3-point hobble on hands and knees that took her to where she dropped her staff. Her outstretched hand caught it by the end, just as a Black Rose assassin leaped from his hiding place, lunged for her. Elora brought her reclaimed staff round like a bat, with the full strength of shoulders behind the blow to crack it across the length of his skull. The assassin dropped like a poleaxe steer. Sadly for Elora, he hadn't come alone. Neither had she. A second tether caught the far end of her staff, yanked it from her grasp. The Black Rose had no chance to capitalise on his advantage, as one of Corey's knives caught him full in the chest with the force of a cudgel. Corey's legs were longer than Elora's, which had made her crossing a tad less helter-skelter. Seeing what was happening, she was able to pick up speed as she went, so that she reached Elora's side in a full-throated charge. As she made that final leap, Thorn swung himself free of her, hitting the rock in a roll that brought him to Elora. Corey drew her sword and swung for the nearest mason. She opened her foe down the whole of his chest and moved to the next before his lifeblood had chance to spray from his gutted heart. Thorn was busy with his own blade as he hacked Elora's bindings. "Be careful!" she cried. "They're using Tanglefoot, and if it catches hold of you, I know the risk!" Thorn barked. Elora was taken aback. "What's wrong?" "This damn place," was his reply, as he cast a quick glance to check on the opposition. Corey's assault had drawn the bulk of Mason attention, but their breathing space wouldn't last long. My blade's coated with an enchantment to counteract a Tanglefoot line, but some aspect of the Malavoy realm mutes its effect. They're not fond of extremes, she told him, except their own. How many Mason are there? Hard to tell. Corey's moving too fast. I can't focus. The realm, you think? Affecting our mage sight? Suddenly, Thorn cried out, pitching himself away from Alora. In his growing fury to see her released, he'd come in direct contact with the Tanglefoot line, and now the end of the filament he'd severed was beginning to climb his forearm. Elora lashed out with both hands to grasp the Tanglefoot on Thorn as she might some deadly serpent. With anyone else, this ploy would have spelled immediate disaster, but the properties of Tanglefoot derived from magic, and magic didn't work well in the Malavoy realm. Moreover, Elora herself was imbued with immunity to spells and enchantments. They could affect her, but only temporarily. This was what she was counting on. She caught the leading end of the filament wrapping Thorn's arm and called on the Nelwyn to cut the line free. Thorn did so, and both were rewarded by the sight of the severed vine shrivelling in their grasp. Even as she looked back to her legs, Elora could see the Tanglefoot looked more brittle around her ankles, where it made initial contact, than her thighs. Thorn's mistake was cutting the wrong end. His shout of warning came at the same instant as Elora's inner flash of alarm. She swept her staff above her head, just in time to block a sword swipe aimed at her companion. It was no mean attack. The impact nearly jarred both arms from their sockets, but her parry gave Thorn the opportunity to pitch a length of Tanglefoot back at their Black Rose assailant. In a trice, the man was off his feet. Then came Elora's mistake, thinking that this Black Rose was out of the fight. Freed of her own bonds, she rolled to her feet to join Corey. Thorn was trying to catch sight of the world gate and any Mason reinforcements. Elora spun round in time to catch a blur of motion from the fallen Mason's free arm, aimed toward Thorn. In that moment, thought and execution were one. Her staff formed a blur of its own as she spun it in her grasp, then cracked its end upside his head hard enough to knock him out. At the same time, Elora stepped sideways to put herself between the Mason and his target, adding a hip check to Thorn's shoulder to knock him clear of danger. There was no time to count the number of spikes the Mason had thrown. She knew she'd caught a pair with her staff, one deflected, one stuck in place. She felt a third whiz by her ear, and registered a tickle of severed hair from its passing. Then all strength went out of her legs, and Elora dropped to her knees, finding it impossible to move, to breathe. Thorn followed his gaze down her torso, to find bare skin streaking red as her outfit. It was a nasty cut, and messy, but it wasn't the wound that did the damage. The last spike had stabbed Elora beneath her rib cage, angling up and in to strike into a lung. That was why she couldn't breathe. All at once, Elora felt like she'd been plunged into an ice bath and a pit of fire. Her vision blurred, Thorn's face flowing like wax into the features of the Mason. Time for her ticked more slowly, yet around her the action hurtled past at headlong rate. A trio of Mason moved to her direction. Thorn scooped up Elora's staff and drove them back. His goal was to keep them occupied. Corey's was to finish them. The warrior's sword was plain steel, yet in her hands left a trail of light in its wake, an after-image of fire as though it were managing to set the ancient air of the Malavoy realm ablaze. It's not flame, Elora realized, chiding herself for being so slow. That's Mason blood. Corey was outnumbered 12 to 1, yet the battle was no contest. We taste thy life, Dannon. The voice was withered, desiccated, speaking in a tone so distant, anyone hearing would have thought the Malavoy was discussing nothing of consequence. Elora knew better, because she was listening, not simply to the words, but the emotions behind them. There was an all-consuming hunger to it, the like of which could never be comprehended by any mortal creature from either side of the veil. What do you want of me? Elora thought. No more, no less than all the world. In return, we offer our strength. I can manage on my own. There was a silence. Elora couldn't tell for how long. There seemed no connection between the presentation of events in her head and what occurred outside. Time held different meanings, like she existed in two different worlds with no way to cross between. She wondered if the Malaboy had abandoned her, and was torn by warring emotions in response, as relieved at their departure as devastated. That was the cue they'd been waiting for, the chink she'd opened in her own inner armor. Thou art the Danon. So you keep saying. The 13th realm that binds all others. A chill laced through her that had nothing to do with her physical wound. That binds all the others, including you, Elora realized. Without us, there is no fulfillment of prophecy. Without us, there can be no salvation. Elora had an overwhelming urge to cry, in a way she'd never allowed herself when she was growing up in Angwin. In those days, crying was a weapon to gain attention. The aching misery of loss, the gnawing sense of aloneness, she tucked deep away, a twisted version of some potentate's private treasure trove. There was fear in her now, and it held resonance of those awful days. Back then, it made her a brat. Here, it drove her yowling to her feet, and in her imagination she saw herself fly forward, unhindered by her wounds, to join her friends in battle. Reality turned out to be simpler. She lasted upright for all of a couple steps before staggering to Corey's grasp. "I can do this!" she tried to protest. "Never doubted it," Corey agreed, scooping Elora into her arms. "Put me down. You can't fight carrying me." "Fight's done," Corey said. "We tarry, so are you. Which way?" "To the left," Elora said. Farther up, a succession of footfalls made their hurried way over the group's heads, the last black rose in hot pursuit. Down her flank, Elora recognized the distinctive blur of power that signaled the nexus of a world gate. "To the left," she said again. There was no dignity to their flight. This was a headlong race for their lives. The Black Rose knew their destination, but such was Corey's speed that only a couple reached the gate before her. Without breaking stride, she plucked Thorn from his perch and slung him full in one assassin's face. The Nelwyn boxed the man's ears, then eyes. As Corey rushed past, she unlimbered Elora's staff, using it with a skill that eclipsed the girl's, to trip Thorn's target and bring him down. The second warrior had only a heartbeat to prepare for Corey's onslaught, but that proved sufficient to prepare a counter. She'd covered better than half the distance between them when he unlimbered a mace, a spiked bull. It was too light to damage anyone armoured. That wasn't its purpose. Instead, weight had been sacrificed for mobility, the advantage of which could readily be seen by the way the mason whipped the chain in a vicious circle about his head. He held the shaft in both hands, put shoulders in spin. There were barbs, too, set at random intervals along the chain. The intent of the weapon was to wrap the chain about its targets. A hearty tug by the mason would drive the barbs into clothes or flesh, making it near impossible to escape. Corey backpedaled frantically to keep from being struck. She withdrew over and over, trying to find the smallest opening for attack, but the mason refused her challenge. He would move as she did, but only enough to make sure she kept a fair distance from the gate. Try as she might, she was unable to pull him from his position, and knew that the longer this took, the closer his companions came. The mason's confidence reeked. To him, the battle was all but won. Elora guessed what Corey had in mind to try next. During her next charge, she wouldn't back off. Instead, she'd take the mason's best shot, gambling on her own skill to survive long enough to finish him. Corey began her advance, and the mason sidestepped to meet her. He actually grinned as he hurled his mace. At that moment, Elora wrenched herself loose of Corey's grasp, surprising them both with the strength left in her. Corey was her fulcrum, and Elora's sudden motion threw her off stride, forcing her to stay on her feet. At the same time, Elora took the mace full on the shoulder. It was a costly stratagem, because she wasn't wearing armour. She felt the bite of spikes as they scored her flesh, knew there was worse to come, but she didn't really care as her outstretched arms wrapped themselves about the chain. Her body's weight did the rest as she tumbled to the ground. That, and the sick realization from the mason that he had just wounded the object of their mission. Shock stopped him dead before Corey finished him with a blade across his throat. "I'm sorry," Elora managed from where she lay, sprawled across his mace chain, as the man dropped to his knees, light fading from his eyes as he fell. Yet part of Elora felt the glorious chitterings of the Malavoy to taste blood once more, and she repressed the urge to bare her own teeth in sympathetic celebration. Like the gate they'd entered through, this was a round of steps cut into the wall of a pit that ended in what appeared to be a pool of molten silver. The stairs made one complete circle of the pit before disappearing beneath the pool. Corey wasted no more time. Once more she gathered up Thorn and took the stairs in headlong, cat-like bounds, reaching the pool just as the remnants of the Black Rose cadre started after them. Then they were climbing stairs identical to the ones they'd just descended. Now Corey's strength was put to the test as she used her momentum to carry them forward and up. Her long legs proved their worth as she mounted the steps 3 at a time, at a pace that would have broken most. Elora didn't care. Her strength was vanishing rapidly. She saw the first of the mason emerge before they reached the summit, heard the whistle of a crossbow bolt close by her ear. Corey laid her gently down, and Thorn hunkered over her, laying out the weapons he'd need for the coming struggle. Corey took position between them and the world gate, bared sword ready in both hands. Elora took a breath, reveling in the winter breeze. There was a scent of pine to the wind, tart, minty, and from some impossible distance she tasted a skein of wood smoke from someone's hearth. This, to her, was true glory. What the Malavoy offered, the realm where they dwelled, was no more than shadows. She heard the clash of arms, blinked once to pull the scene into focus, and beheld Corey at the lip of the world gate, trading sword blows with a mason. She blinked again, but this time her eyes refused to open, and in that rush of darkness came a welcome oblivion.